Is a virus technically life, though? That's exactly the question we're trying to figure out. I think that this is ultimately going to be a dispensable way of defining life. Is it a cell? I mean, in part because, fine, how are we defining what a cell is? How are we defining what a cell is? I'm just thinking about if we explore life outside of this planet. Single cellular life. Cellular. See, even I'm doing it now. I think it might end up being dispensable. So I actually think that one, you would think that that's very clear cut. Does it? Honestly, like, look, if it's not made of cells, a principle of cells is that they're alive. And so it kind of starts being circular to me. We can start arguing about how we're defining a cell. But also, like I said, cells are intrinsically living things. I mean, they can be deceased and in various states of necrosis, but a healthy cell by definition is alive. So I don't know. We're gonna put a little asterisk in that one. Okay, all right. Okay. Metabolism. So far we've talked about a couple of things. We've talked about living organisms. Typically, we consider them to be made of cells. They have some kind of organization, the minimal unit of which we consider to be a cell. But I think you might be able to argue or imagine life forms where there's still organization, but maybe their minimal unit is something that doesn't resemble a cell as we know it. It's a possibility. Okay. Homeostasis. It just means that they can fight entropy, essentially. They can stay organized and they can maintain the chemistry of their whatever, their cells or their, they can control and react like to the basic chemistry around them. All right. And then metabolism. And I know I'm putting all these caveats in. Isn't it annoying, chat? Metabolism seems kind of easy. We can break down sugars and create ATP because all life as we know it relies on ATP. But what if we just take a step backwards and we say, instead of metabolism being glucose into ATP or something into ATP, what if we find a life form that just runs on a different kind of energy? What if it's a different kind of chemical energy, right? Like, what if it still seems like it's a biochemical process? The reaction is just different. And if we make that exception, we can slippery slope ourselves all the way down into just talking about electricity, because ATP and electron gradients, that's all I'm saying. What is ATP? ATP is adenosine triphosphate, but it's essentially the smallest unit of chemical energy that the body uses and like virtually all cells use. And we can look into how it is generated, but it's probably not that helpful. The idea is whether we're getting our energy from glucose or something else. The glucose, the sugar, can be broken down, and part of that metabolism, part of the process of breaking down the glucose, creates this one important chemical form of energy that we call ATP, and it drives all life as we know it. Okay, so for plants it would be light, chlorophyll, or the like. Well, yeah, so for plants, they take the sunlight and generate ATP. So it's the ultimate, like, all life, for the most part as we know it, runs on ATP. And animals and plants and bacteria have different ways of generating that ATP, but it is the fundamental energy source, chemical energy source. All right, so reproduction. I don't actually like the way listen, the Amoeba Sisters are amazing, and they're just trying to power through this because it's a complicated subject, and they probably don't want to make a 30-minute video on it because nobody's going to sit through it, and I understand that. Listen, reproduction, I think the issue of reproduction actually gets very kind of sticky. Let me explain. If we're thinking about reproduction simply as in the case of the horse, right? In the case of the pony, they said sperm and eggs is how they reproduce. Agree. Generally, I agree. That's how humans reproduce also. I can promise you that a woman who's had a hysterectomy and is not capable of reproducing sexually is still very much alive. Okay? Her cells are still dividing. But even that, I think, is a little bit tricky because neurons, I could have a single neuron in a dish. And neurons, when they've been differentiated, a neuron that is in its final glorious state of neuronhood can no longer divide. It can reach out and tickle the feet of a bunch of other neurons. That's part of what it does as being a neuron. But it's not dividing anymore. And we all agree that they are alive. Right? So we can say, okay, well, maybe it's just your cells in your body are dividing, and that's reproducing, right? We still have stem cells in our body, like in our gut and our hair follicles and things. Stem cells in our bone marrow making new blood. So you can say those cells are dividing, and therefore you're still alive because your cells are still dividing. So a neuron that is no longer capable of dividing, I would argue, is still alive. In fact, every scientist I know would say that a neuron is alive. It can react to the environment around it. It's metabolizing. It's made of cells, certainly. So when we think about reproduction, I usually actually think about the opposite. How was that individual thing made? Was it made by something that looks like some form of biological reproduction? Like, where did it come from? Did it come from another cell? So I tend to go backwards rather than forwards. I think it makes more logical sense because there are lots of things that we all agree are alive and are at a certain stage in their development or whatever, and they've lost the ability to reproduce, but that certainly doesn't mean that they have lost the essence of living. Does that make sense? This is why this stuff is so squishy. JD, like agar, vegan, gelatin alternative. Yes. So agrose is a very refined version of agar that you cook with, and it's a common matrix that we use for certain like molecular biology techniques. I know, weird, right? It's far more refined, but essentially we make vegan jello and then do stuff with it in lab. Okay, so glued with gold. I keep thinking about what is the difference between the building blocks of a rock and a plant to be the difference of alive and not alive. I mean, that could be fair. So are you just thinking anything with biomolecules can be alive? So is anything with DNA alive? Because this is one of the big questions. Are viruses alive? Are viruses alive? An ice cube melts in response to heat. Yeah, it does. I would suggest that is, a physical response, but it doesn't meet any of the other criteria. That's why we have a whole bunch of these things. Like an ice cube can't maintain homeostasis, and it can't reproduce, and it can't grow, But yeah, it is. So the stimulus can be really, really subtle. And in this example, they're talking about plants and animals. But you have to remember, a single bacteria is still alive. And bacteria, not all bacteria can respond to light necessarily. They might not have the ability to detect the light. But they can respond to something in their environment. Like bacteria can usually tell when there are other bacteria around, and it might change their chemical signature. That's a response. Electrons respond to light energy. Does that make them alive? Again, Smikes, I mean, I think the point of having a criteria, a list, albeit I think it should be a pretty flexible list, is because there are a lot, pretty much anything can fall into some of these categories, hit at least one of these categories. So, I don't know. I think it's interesting though. A virus can't live on its own though, so I think no. I mean, that's fair. But there are a lot of parasites that we consider to be alive that can't live on their own. Right? Animals that live around thermal vents don't respond to light. This is true. Well, is that true? That might be true. There are a lot of animals that can't detect light. Yeah. There's single-celled and multicellular organisms. There are plenty of them. Yeah, I like that they point this out. The zonkey can't reproduce. Right? Some hybrids are born sterile. Okay, so the last thing there was evolution. Can they evolve? Can they change over time? And we usually think of that not just changing over time randomly, but can they change over time in response to their environment the way we think of natural selection working? I have a really crazy virus that I want to talk about, but I think before we do that, gosh, where is this thing? Okay, we have a SciShow. Are you guys up for a SciShow? It's a long SciShow, but I think it's worth it. They raise the big questions. Local grandpa, is that what they actually look like, or is that just an accepted design to depict this is a virus the same way we depict infinity? Do you mean, let's see, where are we? We're at 204. Let's see. Do you mean, whoa, like this? This, if this is what you're asking about, this is a structure of a bacteriophage. This is a common structure for viruses that viruses take that specifically infect bacteria, and they're called bacteriophage. Viruses can take all sorts of crazy forms, though. Natural selection or sexual selection? Well, it's like, that's a really interesting question. I would say either, but there are a lot of things out there that don't participate in sexual selection because they don't participate in sexual reproduction. So I think the catch-all is natural selection, but I also don't think people are going to split hairs. If you could demonstrate, if something is hitting all of the criteria of being alive, but you cannot demonstrate that it's undergone natural selection and only that it's undergone sexual selection, I don't think you're going to get a big argument from most people. So that actually looks like that. Yes, the bacteriophage actually look like this. They take on this structure, yes. Okay, so I feel like right here, they leave a couple of important things out about viruses that some of you might already know. I'm gonna just repeat it so that we're all on the same page. Viruses, there are an incredible number of viruses out there. Some of them are massive and have pretty complex genomes, like the Mimi virus. But there are also these tiny, ridiculously minimalist viruses. And so sometimes even defining a virus can get a little bit squishy. But I will say, viruses all have some kind of genetic material. A lot of them have DNA. Some of them are RNA based. So they have a genetic code. And they can evolve. Viruses are real stinkers at evolving. Let me tell you. The reason a lot of people like to suggest that they are not alive, even though they have DNA and they can evolve, is because they're not made of cells, and the only way they can do things like reproduce is by hijacking a cell and using their machinery, using the cell's internal components against it. What's interesting is they have the code in their little tiny itty bitty virus genome to do all of that. And so if they're stealing things from the cell and kind of using it to their own devices, does that count? Is that close enough to reproducing and being made of cells? If you use a cell to reproduce. If they aren't alive, what are they? You can't consider them dead. Well, right. Because you only consider things, like I don't consider a rock dead. Right? It is just without life. It is an interesting biological molecule. A rock does not have a genome. So, Smikes, are you suggesting that anything that has a genome is alive? In which case, I have to ask you, Smikes, to take this to an extreme. I make strands of DNA and RNA all the time. I do it a lot. Are those individual life forms? What's the limit? I'm not being, it's a genuine question. It's a genuine question. Okay, so I guess the debate up until this point really is, where do we draw the line? Even if we're going to exclude viruses for a moment, where do we draw the line on what's alive and what's not alive? Because we have this sort of list of criteria, and a lot of people like to get stuck on things like reproduction. Okay, that's fair. So if we start thinking about parasites, there are a lot of parasites that absolutely cannot exist outside of their host. There's a lot of them. But we tend to consider those parasites alive. In fact, it's very rarely is it even debated. They use the example of Wolbachia. Wolbachia live inside flies. And they will not live very long outside of their host. They certainly can't reproduce without their host. Without being inside of a fly. So are they alive? And if we say they are alive, they brought up the question of mitochondria. The theory of mitochondria are the little powerhouses of animal cells. We think they used to be single cellular organisms that a bigger cell ate and turned into a little slave type little. We turned it into an organelle. It's like we didn't remove its essence, but we kind of like we became interdependent on one another, and it feeds the bigger cell energy. Now I'm thinking it has to do more with whether or not something is static. So tell me more. How are you defining static? Is this like the evolution portion? It needs to be able to evolve. Okay, so like he said, these are interesting ideas, but they're far from widely accepted. But they're interesting. It's a fun thought experiment, so we'll roll with them.
Interesting.
Glued with gold. Just if something has the ability to change in any way. A rock is a rock and will always be a rock, but an organism will change depending on its environment or input. Yeah, so it kind of touches on two of those criteria that they were talking about in the Amoeba Sisters video, which is response to stimulus, which can be internal or external. It just means it can respond to the environment in some way. Any way, right? And then the other is sort of a larger scale question about response to the environment, meaning can it evolve? Can over many generations, can it change? And honestly, a virus kind of does both of those things, especially if you agree with this definition. I think this definition is a really interesting suggestion. So the idea is a virus is not particularly alive until it infects a cell. So it's kind of like we can think about sort of like plants releasing their seeds, sort of, although we might argue that seeds are living things, but just roll with me on this. All right, we have a few. Let me just catch up on chat. The Borg is a virus. I know. This is the argument that I was making a while ago. Nobody seemed convinced by it. But maybe the Borg could very well be a virus. Are prions the kind that spread bovine, spongiform, and cephalopith replicants? I mean, so in this case, yeah, I think it probably would be. Probably. But it's not actually an accepted. It's an idea that's been thrown out there by a few people. It's not actually an accepted category. And I would suggest, if we're just breaking it down into replicons, like first of all, sort of what's the point, and have we lost the definition of life? And for that matter, does it matter? For that matter, does it matter? Yeah. I would actually argue that having the ability to categorize something as alive is important, simply because if we're interested in understanding life elsewhere, it would be helpful if we knew what we were looking for. But I think we tend to get a little narrow-minded when it comes to that. Is it even possible for us to fully understand our brains, since, we're using our brains to understand our brains? Yeah, I'm going to say yes. We're just not there yet. Okay, what if all life evolved from viruses? I mean, Smikes, how are we defining a virus in that case? Did all life evolve from a single RNA strand? Probably. Oh, this was a few years ago. This is SciShow. They were sponsored by Brilliant for a while. Let them get their little plug-in. They do good work. We appreciate them. Smikes, do you think we ate our mitochondria at some point and then just let them vibe? I mean, I think so. Is a virus technically life, though? That's exactly the question we're trying to figure out. We don't know. Smikes, I'm going to help you out, though. I'm going to help you out because there's this amazing PBS eons. PBS or eons on the Mimi virus. And so if you guys were leading towards the no, a virus is not alive, then we're going to watch this and maybe you'll go over to Team Smikes, hashtag Team Virus. So how do trees supply the whole world with air, even in the Antarctic with no trees? Well, I think it's just because the oxygen has been released into the atmosphere, and then that's just diffusion. And also, I don't know how, like, if we killed, I've seen this number, and now I don't remember, if we were to eliminate all heterotrophs, how much oxygen do we have? Like, there's a lot of oxygen out there. How many years of oxygen do we have if we were to eliminate all photosynthesizing creatures? I mean, let's not try it, though. Viruses are so different from each other in size and complexity. Yes! Yes, indeed. So this is a virus that you can actually look at under a standard microscope. Normal viruses are so small that you need very specialized kinds of microscopes to look at them. This guy, people are like, yeah, it's just a bacteria. Nothing to see here. Just a weird bacteria. Wrong. It was a huge freaking virus. So we were dealing with human excrement in not the best ways for a long time. Yeah, so these freaking viruses are nuts, you guys. They have so much more genetic material than most normal run-of-the-mill viruses that we're accustomed to seeing, and they have a lot more of the bits that we think of that, like, bacteria would have. An actual living thing. It has a lot of the blueprint for life as we know it. Like, that genome is looking pretty similar, but it's still technically a virus. Yeah. Blurry. It's squishy. As all things science, it's squishy. Do they even have an idea as to what the viruses need to infect to reproduce? So we think that they just infect the way other normal viruses infect. So they only infect amoeba. And so the amoeba has some, like, unique biology that they think is interacting here. But it's interesting that the viruses don't infect, like, human cells or bacterial cells. Okay. All right. So, chat, we're talking about viruses, or more specifically, the definition of life, and if viruses fall within that umbrella term, that very squishy umbrella term. So right now, we are on the subject of the Mimi virus, which is a giant virus. It has a much bigger genome than most viruses that we think of, and it also has some parts, some genes, cellular parts that we don't normally think of when we're considering viruses. So the question is, are they somewhere in between a traditional virus and a living cell, as we conventionally think about it? And if so, if it is somewhere in between, which direction is it going? Is it a virus becoming more like a cell, or was it a cell that is slowly becoming more and more minimalist, finding its way to be more like a virus? Okay, so there's a couple really crazy theories going on here. And by crazy, I mean exciting, not scientifically invalid. So the idea is, okay, partly, is a virus alive? Or really, what is the definition of life? And when you're considering that, you can start to think about the directionality. Are viruses just separate things that float around and created sort of in parallel to life, and they just hijack living things? Or is there some kind of directionality? Did living things evolve from viruses? Or the opposite? Did viruses come from originally living things? Again, you can argue about if a virus is alive or not, but come along with me in this journey. Individual cells. Did individual cells just start losing parts of their genome to become viruses? So really, there's three options that I've seen that they're presenting here, and I think it's cool either way. The start of evolution feels so crazy to wrap my head around it. Yeah. And the direction of it. How is the virus related to normal cellular organisms as we think of them? And is it possible that viruses just have different origins? Right? Like the idea that, like, what if these giant viruses are becoming virus-like, but the tiny little itty-bitty viruses have a completely different origin, and they're just all made of the same biological stuff, and it can be hard for us to tell them apart, trace their origins over time. It even happens between plants. This, I think, is really cool. Parasitic plants will steal genes from their host plants. It makes them better at parasitizing. Yeah. Why evolve a whole new mechanism when you can just steal it from the thing you're living inside, right? Biology's metal, y'all. Giant viruses. Once again, number one, are viruses alive? And number two, since they brought it up, where did viruses freaking come from? Did they just become created, alongside cellular life? Or was there directionality to it? Like, did viruses come, evolve, and create cellular life? Or did cellular life start to revert and, like, minimize itself until it's like a really extreme parasite? In which case, does that change how we categorize viruses as alive or not? Yeah, or something completely different, right? Or none of those things. We are talking about what makes something alive. And are viruses alive? I was planning on pulling out a whole bunch of weird sci-fi creatures and asking the question after we landed on are viruses alive, but I gotta be honest, I'm not sure we're gonna even round out the are viruses alive tonight. Not coronavirus, actually. This is mimic virus. Sorry. It's a mimi virus. It's a giant virus. It's one of the most complex viruses that, it's a class of viruses. Extremely complex. Larger than most viruses by like an order of magnitude, and it also means that their genomes are a lot bigger and more complex, and it's raising a lot of questions about the origin of viruses, and if viruses can be this complex, at what point do we start classifying them as being alive? Yeah, complicated. Microbe mimicking virus, yes, thank you. question best avoided. A large chunk of microbiology studies were taken up arguing about whether microorganisms were life. Yeah. Yeah. The definition definitely shifts. And it's also entirely reasonable. You know, I guess this is the thing that grinds my gears. When I took like Gen Bio exactly a million years ago, you know, in college, they give you this list of things that you have to memorize. This is the definition of life. And you just have to regurgitate it onto a test, a Scantron test, or, you know, in an essay or whatever. That's what they're looking for. And the thing is, actual scientists don't even agree on what makes something alive. I mean, we have general principles, but the thing is, it's not like just a checklist where everything that's alive has to meet every single one of those checklists, especially not at every stage of its existence. It's a lot more complicated, and I love that it's more complicated. It's far less interesting if it's just, you know, 5 things that you need to check off. Far less interesting. Fishman, I am now 100% certain that I have no clue if viruses are living. I think that that's a fair place to be. I actually like the suggestion that viruses are alive in certain stages. Like that a virus has a life cycle, and that it is alive when it is infecting a cell, because then it meets all of the definitions needed for life, because it has taken over a cell. It just gets complicated then, because they say there are 2 living things that are sharing the same cell. And is that possible? I think at one point the life list contained something about getting energy from the sun, and then they found deep vent critters who survive on chemicals. Yeah, now it's just they have to metabolize. They have to have a way of harnessing and using energy. And usually the people will specify that it has to be like a biochemical energy, because they don't want to be dealing with like electrons. Even though, you know, electron potential and, you know, membrane potential and whatnot and mitochondria. But we're going to set that aside. Okay. All right. I think on this chat, we're going to round out. That's how I feel about the replicon. If you guys were here for the whole stream, there was a suggestion in one of the earlier videos that we just dispense with the idea of life and just break it down into replicons. Is it something that is essentially a biomolecule that can replicate itself? But at that point, I feel like we're no longer actually exploring. At that point, I just have to wonder why. Unless we're going to argue that having a definition of life just isn't useful. But then what the heck are we looking for out on other planets? How will we know life when we see it? Or is it just like the Supreme Court? I can't give it a name, but I know it when I see it.